Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Blink Innovation this morning. Level 2, but we're going to talk about grass and whether grass will be greener on the other side of the fence. And grew up on a farm, and always when I looked over the fence, the grass always had a different color than on our side. And then I went to uni, and there was a professor that basically told me, I said, Wim, that's the light that is doing that to you. Because the top of the grass has a different color than the bottom of the grass. So when you walk to the other side of the fence, and you look back, the grass has a different color. So there you go. That was my explanation. But of course, that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about regenerative farming this morning. Well, Blink Innovation, what we are all about. We basically do three things. We try to connect people. By actually connecting people, hopefully we get people actually talking to each other. And after that connection, hopefully there will be collaboration. And if people start to collaborate 9 out of 10 times, you will actually get innovation. So those are the three pillars that Blink Innovation actually works on. We try to connect people, and this is very much what we're doing here. So I know a lot of you already know each other, but the ones that you don't know each other, those are the ones that you need to connect to, because then hopefully you can start collaborating and innovating. Like we said, is the grass always greener? We're going to talk about regenerative farming, and we're going to get some really practical examples as well from our speakers. If you think that we are doing a great job and you want to talk about this as well, please connect with us on social media. You can either do that on Twitter or on LinkedIn or on Facebook. So what I want to do is I want to introduce our speakers. We have three speakers. We have Sam Lang, and who is an independent researcher, is one of the founders of Quorum Sense, and is also a Newfield scholar. Then the second speaker that you will listen to is Emily House. She works for Fifth Business Agri, and she's a technical advisor. And then John O'Frew, and he is actually an agricultural coach in the regen space, and he will actually talk about his ventures and soil health. What I'll do is I'll introduce the speakers more in detail when I actually call them up. After every speaker, I will introduce the second speaker. After the last speaker, we'll actually have the Q&A session. So what I'll do is I'll introduce Sam. Sam basically is creating a network. Is creating a network of farmers to start sharing information and knowledge about regen agriculture. He does that through Quorum Sense, and the nice thing is that he is looking at all these different examples that are actually happening, creating this network, and with that, hopefully the network will actually start to learn from each other, and the network become larger and larger and larger. He has experience as being a farmer, and he managed a high hill country farm in Hawke's Bay. And he traveled the world doing his Newfield scholarship, which he completed in 2016. Sam, I'd like to introduce you as our first speaker. Thank you very much.
I've got a few hats, I suppose. At the moment, my main job is managing Quorum Sense, so it's a farming network which kicked off a couple of years ago. I didn't found it, but I was lucky enough to move down to Christchurch soon after the group grew, which is thanks in a huge part to Jono's energy and enthusiasm and vision, so you'll hear a bit from him later. And I'm lucky enough to have sort of jumped on board and now manage the group, and it's a pretty epic bunch of farmers. At the same time, I do a bit of research work, particularly with a lady called Dr. Gwen Gralley at a Manaaki Whenua, and looking forward to getting back on farm sometime soon. So we've got a few things in a few pies trying to do that and drag my city partner out to the country. I suppose I'm going to, as the first of three, I'm just going to do a bit of an overview and let Emily and Jono dive into a bit more detail. So if that's frustrating, apologies for that. I started my farming career, I've got a split family on both sides, but I started on what you call a conventional high-performing lamb finishing and bull beef farm with my uncle up in Hawke's Bay, and got really interested in, I've always been really interested in this connection between the land and people, and that's kind of flowed through a lot of the work that I did at university and with Patrick here in my Kellogg's course and that. And that eventually led to a Nuffield scholarship. Cool, so that was the farm that I started on up in Hawke's Bay. And the next one, please. So I was lucky enough to get a Nuffield scholarship in 2016. I'd been thinking about the future of hill country farming from that first farm and wondering about what the future would look like. Particularly interested in how do we actually go through, how do we actually support rural communities through significant shifts in farm system in a really healthy way. So there was lots of shifts in the 80s when subsidies came off and there was a whole lot of pain, and as much as we celebrate it these days, you know, there was a whole lot of pain and a whole lot of farm losses and failure and trauma associated with that. So my question was kind of how do we do that positively? So that was the question I set off on with Nuffield, and kind of it started there thinking about, you know, what are the similarities and what's worked in a whole lot of different countries and a whole lot of different farm systems all over the world. It was an amazing experience, and as part of that, one of the things that came out of it was that the examples of success and innovation are really community driven. So farmers getting together and actually owning the direction of their farm systems and kind of taking on the being responsible for their own learning and understanding their farm system, so they're not being sold something all the time, but they're actually empowered. And that it was always a grassroots driven situation that was leading to success, and never a top-down one, and sometimes there was a bit of both. And the last thing, just because I had a sustainability lens in terms of where we might be going, and the farmers I was visiting, I got to visit probably well over 100 farmers that were all doing kind of things that you might call sustainability oriented. And they had a whole lot of different names and labels for that, and regenerative farming was kind of emerging at the time, and it was a bit of an umbrella catch-all for this kind of ecologically driven farm system. So those are the kind of key takeaways that I came home with thinking, oh, this is kind of what I want to be involved in and where I want to go. So a global perspective on, we can call it regenerative agriculture because that's the kind of the label of the day, but there's about 6 different countries here we've got Canada, Ecuador, Uruguay, a couple from New Zealand, New York, Scotland, England, and all applying the same kind of thinking and principles to completely different farm systems and completely different contexts. So there's this idea that is regenerative agriculture just an idea that's imported out of the USA, and is it relevant for New Zealand? I think it's the wrong question. We need to dive deeper into what's kind of the meaning and the principles and the understanding that sits behind that label, because that's all it is really. And what I discovered was that there was a whole lot in common, and it's kind of the outcomes that these farmers are achieving, and the kind of, some of the most inspired and connected farmers that I've ever met were some of these ones applying these principles. So that's why I got excited about it. So yeah, key insights, common principles across different farming systems. In terms of how do we understand this thing, I think about it as systems of practices that are founded on a biological or ecological knowledge system. And what I discovered is that they can create high-performing farm systems across, your triple or quadruple bottom lines, however you want to frame that. Best outcomes achieved when we get farmers driving things from a grassroots perspective, but working with their community and the wider sector and industry, and making sure that they adapt ideas and principles and thinkings to their local context, because no 2 farms are the same, and so how they operate shouldn't be the same. And I really love this quote from a lady called Lisa Heenan, who I've done a couple of workshops with, and one day she just came out with this: when you know better, you do better. So rather than being like, this is right and wrong, or better and worse, and that kind of stuff, it's like, well, what do we know, and how do we apply that knowledge to the best of our abilities? There's everyone's always asking about what's the definition of regenerative agriculture, how do you define it? For the purposes of helping I've spent four years now kind of wrapping my head around this kind of thing. So the way that I kind of break it down is you've got this concept of a regenerative farm system, which is primarily an outcomes-focused approach. So thinking about, I don't actually care how you do it, I just care about what you're achieving. So I care about the health of your animals, health of your soil, the quality of your produce, your profitability, your mental health, etc. Those are all outcomes that we care about. That's what we want. Don't really care whether you are using which practices or animals or trees or whatever that you're using to achieve that. But thinking about it if you're thinking about a regenerative farm system, you're thinking about the whole. So again, that quadruple bottom line, or however you want to break it down. And it is a challenge for some of our science structures and stuff to think in that, because what we're fundamentally dealing with is complex adaptive systems, and that's just hard. And we'll come back to that later. Regenerative agriculture, however, this is kind of how I just differentiate it anyway, and other people will have different ways, but regenerative agriculture is kind of a movement, community, narrative, or whatever. You could say it's kind of defined by a set of principles and systems of practices, again, founded on this ecological paradigm with the idea of shifting everything in a more positive direction, so this continuum of practice across multiple outcomes and trying to shift everything together, and on the principle that everything's connected, so we can't disconnect profitability from animal welfare or from soil health, from water quality, for example. Outcome goal oriented, I've talked about continuous improvement, and context specific. So for these reasons, it makes it really hard to define and reduce into this kind of simple thing. So that's kind of why you get a lot of resistance to that question, I suppose, because I'd argue it's probably the wrong question. So practices, just some pictures to illustrate diversity, I suppose. You've got an arable system here in Leaston with intercropping, basically 2 or 3 crops in the same system. Some wintering systems in Southland, which is not what we're used to seeing, photos of wintering systems in Southland. So the idea, I'll just leave it, that's different. This is a multi-species winter crop, high diversity. Jono might talk a little bit more about the thinking and the understanding behind that. You've got Steve Wynne-Harris's farm up on the top left, or your top right there, and I put that up there because it's a fantastic example of how you can integrate trees in a really clever and strategic way, and apply just a really a fantastic kind of pastoral animal management system on top of that. And we can't forget the importance of management. And in a pastoral system, lots of the conversations about all these, cover crops, biostimulants, lots of that come, but the heart of it, you're never going to actually achieve, in my perspective as a grazier, you're never going to achieve the kind of goals you're thinking if you don't get your kind of management foundation right. And we've heard a lot of that, dairy farmers are fantastic at, managing residuals and rotation length and all that kind of stuff. We're starting to change the thinking in terms of what we're trying to manage from a soil ecology perspective. What's happening across New Zealand, and something it's quite common around the world, is this concept of this kind of movement that Quorum Sense is kind of representing to an extent. In New Zealand is actually reflected across all around the world in lots of different ways. But it's really exciting getting farmers that are coming together and kind of learning and sharing and being really generous with their knowledge and kind of understanding that exchange that can happen. And so Quorum Sense has got these really awesome networks where you've got 120 farmers on a WhatsApp chat, or 2,500 people on a Facebook group, and we're going to continue to evolve those kind of things. And the access to knowledge and experience, which is coming from an independence, also doesn't mean that the advisor-supplier knowledge system is not useful, but it's being able to complement that. So as a farmer, you're kind of building your foundational understanding and having these kind of peers and mentors that you can rely on, and that just completely changes the kind of the nature of the conversation and the energy. And you just got just hundreds of farmers who are just super excited about what they're doing, and that's just the most infectious thing that I've ever been involved with. And I think I was just going to finish on science, which is one of the big questions, and I assume there's a few researchers here, seeing as we're at Lincoln. I do have a photo of a presentation that Derek Mook gave a couple of years ago, and I really liked some of his key conclusions around that, where we're starting to tap into the long-lasting issues we've had following the CRI reforms, the lack of public good funding. There's a couple of other points that he made, and another one of his favourite quotes being, excellent agricultural science only ever happens in the field. And I think those points are extremely relevant to the conversation we're having today about regenerative ag and that kind of stuff, where we're, every time we try and, if we think about science in terms of can we do some plot trials here and control a couple of variables and see if it works, it just doesn't really work in a regenerative, if you apply this kind of ecological thinking, because you're managing dozens of variables all the time, and it's actually the interaction between the farm manager and the season that makes the difference. It's not something you can control and prescribe and plan out and follow that. And you see there's scientists, particularly in the States, that have tried to do that with some of the grazing systems, for example, and they say, oh, it doesn't work. And all the farmers say, well, why didn't you extend your rotation when it got really dry? Because you just ended up coming back faster and running out of grass. To a farmer, that's really obvious, but to the researchers that were studying, and it wasn't, because of their understanding of what holistic management was in this context wasn't the same as the farmers. And because of that, it's just, and it's the same with, if you're trying to look at fertilisers by themselves or multi-species pastures by themselves or any of that by themselves, often the research results aren't going to reflect what the farmers are seeing in the field. And so our approach, and Gwen Grelle and I are working on what's called a think piece on regenerative agriculture that's funded by the Land and Water National Science Challenge and the Next Foundation. So it's just a kind of setting out if we were to look at regenerative systems in New Zealand in terms of outcomes and performance, how would we actually go about that? Like, what are the outcomes that we care about? How are they important to different people? And then what are the kind of overarching methodologies that we would apply in order to actually look at these systems and their kind of as kind of in real terms? And that's quite a different way of, we're thinking about, do we actually go and work with 100 farmers over 5 or 7 years in quite a level of detail in order to do this, and what can we learn in the process, as well as some of the fundamental science questions that come alongside that. So I'm going to stop there, but that's kind of where we're heading. I think there's a pretty massive opportunity, but it is really challenging working with our current science funding system, which I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with. And this is no different. So I'm going to leave it there and leave the fun, technical, detailed diving stuff to my peers. Thanks very much.
Sam, thank you very much. And I want to introduce Emily. Emily works for Fifth Business Agriculture, and she's a technical advisor. The cool thing about Emily is that she actually works with farmers every single day, and she tries to combine 3 things. She tries to combine nutrition, animal health and animal welfare, and soil health. And she is actually coaching and helping farmers throughout New Zealand to deal with that. Without any further ado, Emily, I will ask you to do your talk. Thank you.
So, as Wim mentioned, I'm going to be talking about animal health and performance in regenerative farming settings, and looking at some ways that we can maybe measure the good life. So at Fifth Business Agri, what we do is we try to link pasture and dietary mineral composition to animal health and performance. Basically, all the major production limiting syndromes that you find in dairy and dry stock situations, they're all interlinked. And when you look at how they're interlinked, they actually all come back to macro and trace element nutrition. So this approach, it's based on peer-reviewed published data and 15 years of experience. It was developed by a vet who got frustrated by always treating clinical issues, and he wanted to try and prevent these things. Obviously, being a vet, he was used to using bloods and livers to diagnose clinical issues, but he found that these weren't particularly good for finding insufficiencies and excesses in the diet. So he was looking at ways to identify these insufficiencies, not just straight out deficiencies or toxicities. And he did this, he started looking at pasture mineral composition, so pasture being the main component of the diet in most systems. And as you can see, it's quite complex. There's lots of relationships between these different minerals in the soil, in the plant, and in the animal. But we've developed a model that actually lets you tackle this. So, the basis of our approach is centred on the animal. So what we do is to look at what the animal requires to perform, and then calculate how well the diet is meeting those animal requirements. We do this using our dietary analysis, so that diet decoder. And once we've calculated this out, we come up with an action plan. So in the short term, that might look like supplementation, targeted at that herd and that farm. So it's a very customised approach, and it's unique to each farm. Every farm has a different mineral profile, depending on their fertiliser management, soil type, pasture species. In the longer term, what we're actually looking to do is try and control that mineral profile in the pasture. And this means we like to have some influence on the fertiliser program fertiliser is a huge driver of animal health issues. And so what we find as we apply this process, we actually end up with a smaller nutrient footprint. This basically, the outcome of this is optimal animal health and production and improved soil health. So when Julia asked me to do this talk, one of the questions she posed was, what does regenerative agriculture mean to me? For me, it's about building health. It's about building soil health, plant health, animal health, and the health of our communities and people. And all of these things are interrelated. So now I'm just going to have a look at what impact does regenerative farming have on animal health and performance. What are some of the practices in regenerative agriculture that contribute to animal health? So anecdotally, we hear a lot of evidence for the good life, a lot of improved performance, reduced facial eczema, reduced metabolics, improved reproductive outcomes, and a whole host of other animal health outcomes. But what are some of the contributing factors? So management practices, this practice of high density rotational grazing. There's actually a couple of things around this that could be helping with animal health. Frequent shifting of stock. Sometimes they're shifting their stock 2 to 3 times a day. And this gives the farmer more opportunity to notice, basically, if something's wrong. So he's seeing his stock more, he can intervene earlier and you get better animal health outcomes. Grazing height, we're grazing higher levels of the pasture. Now this reduces the risk of facial eczema and parasitic infection. So both facial eczema spores and parasite larvae and eggs are concentrated in the lower levels of the grasses of the pasture. So it's basically just less exposure. I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly or we'll run out of time. Improve soil health. How does this improve our animal health? If we consider fungi, it's been shown, and this is all from published studies, that beneficial fungi will outcompete facial eczema spores. They'll also act on parasites to reduce the worm burden. And improve nutrient holding capacity, so healthier soils drive nutrient density of plants, with the potential for those plants to better meet animal requirements. What are the health benefits of multi-species pastures? A lot of these species within these mixed pasture swards have something called plant secondary metabolites or phytochemicals. These have a number of proven benefits for animal health. I won't go over it in detail, but including antibacterial, antifungal, and antiparasitic effects. Does pasture sward diversity affect animal performance? That's a really good question. There's a number of studies that have been done looking at diverse pasture swards and whether performance is enhanced or inhibited in these systems. In most cases, performance was equal to or improved in multi-species pastures versus ryegrass clover pastures. Reduced nutrient inputs. So I find this is quite common in regenerative agriculture. They're looking to rationalise, in particular, fertiliser inputs. Could this be beneficial to animal health? And I'm going to say, in most cases, yes, I think it could. In my job, time and time again, I see fertiliser driving animal health issues, in particular metabolic issues. And I'm talking about overuse of fertiliser here. So poor fertiliser choice and timing is a key driver of metabolic issues. Most farmers would be aware of potassium and how it interferes with magnesium absorption. Particularly in a dairy situation, this causes or can contribute to clinical milk fever. But also excessive phosphorus, and that's related to the calcium-phosphorus ratio, is also a contributor of metabolics. So in these systems where we have lower potassium and phosphorus inputs and potentially higher calcium levels in our pastures, in our mixed pasture swards, do we have a reduced metabolic risk? And I think this, to me, is really important. We need to understand that nutrient management is not just about the environment. So what's unacceptable for the environment, in many cases, isn't optimal for the animals being farmed in it either. And I use the example of excessive nitrogen. That'll drive crude protein levels in the pastures. High crude proteins over calving actually require more energy to metabolise at a time when the cows are already low in energy and trying to give birth. But also antagonises magnesium So yeah, all these things are interrelated. Conversely, what's acceptable for the environment isn't necessarily acceptable for the animals being farmed in it. And in this example, I want to use sulphur. Sulphur doesn't really get considered in terms of environmental impacts, but excessive sulphur in pastures can cause palatability issues. It can also interfere with copper and selenium absorption in the animal, and it can reduce intakes as well. So removing these excess nutrients can improve animal efficiency and create a more profitable system. So as we've seen, there's multiple contributors to the good life, but is there a link between the mineral composition of multi-species pastures and improved animal health outcomes? So what are the nutritional differences between multi-species pastures and ryegrass clovers? And I'm going to take a quick look at that now, if we move on. I'm going to focus on macro minerals first. Recently had the opportunity to participate in a pilot study looking at soil fertility and different management practices, and this has been led by Gwen Grellet at Landcare Research and Sam Leng, who we've just heard from. So as part of this study, I sampled pastures from 5 paired farms, so neighbouring farms on the same soil type, and I sampled multi-species pastures on one side, ryegrass clover on the other, and fully aware that this is a very small sample size, there are still some trends that I can see. Multi-species pastures in most cases had much higher or significantly higher calcium levels in them, and I have a feeling this is to do with plantain in the swards. Plantain tends to be high in calcium, and I'll get on to the lower P in a minute, but there was no significant difference in soil calcium base saturation status, so I'm pretty confident it wasn't linked to the soil status, calcium soil status. We'll see that pasture phosphorus levels were in all cases lower in the multi-species pastures, but in all except for one example, this is the range here for optimal pasture growth. They were still optimal, okay, but just not as excessive as in some of these ryegrass clover samples. And why that's significant is, again, back to this calcium to phosphorus ratio, which is one of the drivers of metabolic risk. A calcium to phosphorus ratio below 1.5 can often cause metabolic issues, both in dairy and dry stock situations. So we can see that this risk is a lot lower in the multi-species pastures. Moving on to trace elements, we can see here when we looked at copper pasture levels, that copper was either equal to or higher in the multi-species pastures. And again, this could be driven by plantain. But, I mean, the difference is only 1 to 2 parts per million, so that's not going to make a huge difference in terms of animal sufficiency. But if we also look at pasture sulphur, then you'll see that in most cases, except for one multi-species pasture here where they had it put on autumn sulphur fertiliser, that pasture sulphur levels are slightly lower. As I said before, sulphur will antagonise copper, even without molybdenum present. So combined with the higher copper, the lower sulphur levels, you actually have a potential to better meet the nutritional requirements of the animal in terms of copper sufficiency. These numbers up here are actually the number of years since these farms had applied any sulphur fertiliser. So what's really interesting is despite having not put any sulphur fertiliser on from anywhere from 2 to 10 years, there was still plenty in the plant. Just quite an interesting observation there. So both multi-species and ryegrass clover pastures were consistently insufficient or deficient with respect to animal requirements in terms of trace elements. And that's not uncommon in New Zealand. It's a function of our soil types. So why would we bother pasture testing at all? Can't we just make this assumption and supplement the animals accordingly? Well, I think this is where it's really important to understand the bigger picture and the full picture on every farm. So sufficiency is not directly related to the mineral level in the pasture. You can't just look at the lab result and go, oh yeah, this is low or high, therefore it's going to meet animal requirements. And I'll use this as an example. This is from one of the dry stock farms. molybdenum levels came up as very high. Neighbouring farm, not a problem. They were within the optimal range. Not quite sure what's driving these higher molybdenums, but as a result of that, it's going to react with sulphur and cause copper antagonism to quite a high degree. So it's just an example of why pasture sampling can be beneficial. Does pasture diversity reduce risk? Lots of pretty colours here, and I won't concentrate on it too much, just to point out that these are different species within a mixed pasture sward, and they all concentrate minerals to different levels. So we can see here that vetch is quite high in phosphorus, prairie grass not so high. Plantain, again, I was saying it's quite high in sulphur, but also really good calcium levels and quite good copper levels. And these are from the same paddock, same area, in the same paddock. So in a system where you've just got ryegrass clover, you've got less diversity. If you've got high phosphorus in the ryegrass, it's high phosphorus in the whole sample, basically. Whereas here, you may have insufficiency in some, but the vetch will make up for the low sulphur in the prairie grass, etc. So have we reached nirvana? I think we need to be a little bit careful about the mentality that we've fixed the soil, therefore the animals will thrive. In systems where we're looking to reduce inputs, it's really important that we make sure that these pastures are still meeting animal requirements. We need to be careful of dietary antagonisms. For example, we've seen that these multi-species pastures have the potential to be high in calcium. The higher the calcium level, the more selenium antagonism you're going to get. So again, that's going to affect this trace element status of your animals. Cobalt nutrition, often particularly in dry stock situations where they're grazing winter crops, they'll rely on, and in dairy situations, they'll rely on soil ingestion to a degree for cobalt nutrition. So where we're looking at covered soils, then we need to be aware of that. So it's really important to understand the nutrient cycle and how it affects not just the soil-plant relationship, but also that with the animal. And then this concept of free choice mineral supplementation, which is quite a big one in regenerative circles. And there's a lot of studies indicating that free choice in animals works in terms of energy, protein, fibre. They're able to balance these when they're given the option. But when it comes to mineral supplementation, if we're talking a deficiency, so there's lots of studies showing where they've induced a deficiency, the animals seek to correct that. But that relies on post-ingestive feedback. So the animal has to feel sick before they go and seek to correct that, and then they learn that behaviour. They associate that with feeling, that particular mineral with feeling better. If we're talking about insufficiencies that are going to affect, or not necessarily cause a clinical deficiency, but affect performance, then does this free choice mineral supplementation, will the animal supplement to the point of sufficiency? And will it support optimal performance? And my feeling on this is probably not. So final thoughts, is regen ag for everyone? I think it can be. I think, it's, as Sam pointed out, we put a label on it, but there are a lot of practices that we can adopt in conventional farming systems that are going to be beneficial, not just to soil health, but animal health as well. As we've seen, it involves multiple practices that have the potential to benefit animal health. And there's evidence for improved performance grazing multi-species pastures. There's also the potential for more balanced macro mineral profiles, and this is a combination of reduced inputs and diverse pasture swards. But as I said, it's important to recognise that there's still risks, and I think particularly with multi-species pastures, where you've got some species coming through more dominantly over different seasons, then seasonal pasture sampling dietary analysis could be quite beneficial, just to check that you're still meeting the nutritional requirements of those animals. And the nutritional status of the animal is a really important measure of the good life. However, there's not a lot of studies on this, so it would be, there could be a lot more work done in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Introducing Jono. I met Jono at a farm, and we were in a little van, and he jumped out, got a shovel, and started digging into the soil, and then shared his knowledge with a tremendous amount of people around him, and that were very interested in what he had to say. Jono is a coach, and he is concentrating on soil health and sharing his knowledge on that. Jono.
Awesome. Thanks, Vim. I said the trend is to stand on the side or follow the trend. Morning everybody. My name's Jono Frew. I am a regenerative agriculture farm coach. The term coach is not something often thrown around. It's sort of more used in terms of, you hear, professionals using coaches, and you hear, my brother's a personal trainer, he's a coach. You don't often hear about it in farming circles. Well, why I landed on that word is because through my whole experience as a farmer, I spent 15 years as a farmer and a chemical agronomist. What was missing for me was a sense of contribution, or being enabled to make a contribution. I was more sort of, and what we all get used to is following prescriptions and following, already existing paths told, to us by our advisors. And for me as a farmer, what it did for me was it allowed me to avoid responsibility, so that when things went wrong, I got to say, well, actually, no, it was his fault. But in that, there was a lack of fulfillment because I wasn't applying myself, I wasn't being creative. So coach for me is, what I do is I go out and teach people the foundations and functions underneath all of the principles, some of which I'll talk to you about this morning, but more so giving them the knowledge so that they can make their own choices and create for themselves the systems that work for them, which, as you've heard this morning from our speakers, is very diverse amongst everyone, and even within systems amongst paddocks, and even within paddocks amongst square metres. And so being able to adapt and be fluent about it, the way in which we make choices as farmers is pretty cool. So that's what I do. I spent 10 years in the dairy industry, got really good at getting milk out of cows and just cranking the production. And what was missing in that whole time was an understanding of the cost of that production, not just from a monetary perspective, but also on the fact that I was watching all of the rivers that I was farming around drop in flow and increase in their algal blooms, and to the point where we couldn't swim or fish in them anymore. And all of these things were going on that I wasn't aware of. I was too focused on the, what's right in front of me, too focused on the laid out path in front of me, trying to keep up with everyone and beat everyone. With production was very hard for me to see exactly what was going on around me. After a few events in my life where I was hit with some interesting circumstances, I began to inquire into what else is there out there. I got offered a job. I went from managing a local, very local here, chemical application company, aerial and ground spraying and fertiliser application company, to managing a local organic mixed cropping sheep and beef farm just down the road here, which really changed my perspective. I had no idea of how to farm organically. I winged it for 3 years there and learned a whole lot. Murph's laughing because he spent some time with me there. So what I learnt there was phenomenal, and that's why I started Quorum Sense, was because what I learnt was like, wow, I just had no idea the stuff existed. For instance, biology, a lot of which we've not talked about this morning, I'm going to talk a bit about with you this morning, wasn't part of my toolkit. It wasn't something that I had access to understanding. And when I started to understand the sheer magnitude of the effects of biology on not just our farming systems, but us as human beings, it became really fascinating to me, such that I applied myself learning at a rapid rate, more than what I'd ever learnt through school, through all my years of farming, of prescription-based conventional farming, of just copying everyone and trying to beat everyone. It just gripped me that profoundly, that I started to surround myself with farmers doing cool stuff, and that's where Quorum Sense was born. And we're lucky to have Sam at the helm now, because it's gotten to a level where it's beyond that little discussion group that it started out as, and it's just really, humbling to see the difference that a group like that can make, where we're open with our sharing. And that was a big shift for me too, was going from being righteous and knowing everything to being open to actually, and listening to people like, maybe these people know something that I don't, and that's been really cool. So that's what I do. let's talk a bit about biology. So when we talk about biology, you know, most people think, oh, worms and little critters, and yeah, that's valid. Let's take it a step further. So just for your understanding, and I'm mindful of the range and understanding within the participants here this morning, let's start at the basics. So when we're talking about biology in the soil, you know, there's more microbes in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are humans on the planet. For those of you that don't know that, you know, just let that sink in. All of those microbes have their own unique role in the system. Like us as human beings, we're all good at different things, whether we express that or not, depending on the context. Sometimes we're in positions where we like to keep the same and we're all benchmarked on the same curriculum, and that's cool, we get the same results. And you know, when we look back at the problems that have come with the thinking that got us to where we are today, was actually not the same thinking that's required for solving those problems, you know, the thinking that got us here. And so being a bit different is pretty cool in the soil. Biologically, when we have diverse microbial populations in the soil, we get lots of different resilience factors. You know, in human beings, in our communities, we want builders, we want hairdressers, we want farmers, we want physicians, we want all these different things. And the more diverse things in our communities, the more resilient our communities. Well, the soil is no different. So when we're talking about microbial diversity, what's first important is we stop doing the things that are killing them. You know, the things that are destroying our biology in the soil. You know, a lot of which has been outlined this morning. You know, tillage, not so cool on our fungal populations in the soil. A lot of excessive chemical use. I'm not going to get down on chemicals here and fertilizers because they are a tool, all of which you can use in a regenerative context, but just using them, you know, mindfully, understanding the impacts. So first, you've got to pull out the things that are damaging your biology. Secondly, you've got to provide a home for that biology. So when we're talking about the home for the biology or the habitat for the biology, then the soil, what's important with that is air. That's one of the biggest limiting factors. So when we're looking at our soil, we're looking at soil porosity. Can our soil house our microbes? And if it's anaerobic and compacted, the only microbes that are going to survive are anaerobic bacteria, which when they're really, really overpopulated, aren't so cool. They produce lots of fine soil particles when they get too active and too out of whack with the fungi. They produce waxy coatings that protect themselves against the elements, which then make our soils hydrophobic and then repel water. When we do get rain, it all runs off. We don't want too much bacteria. So air is really important. How we get air is we stop the things that are compacting our soil. A lot of that is caused by mismanagement of our animals. It's also caused by lack of biological functions due to our management inputs. You know, the things that are killing the biology, it's the biology that makes the soil open and porous. You know, it's the start of all life. If we don't have bacteria, we don't have protozoa, then we don't have worms. Okay, so getting the habitat's really important. There's a chemical ratio that I look at quite often when we're talking about the porosity in the soil or the structure within the soil, and that's the calcium-magnesium ratio. So depending on your cation exchange capacity, if you're in the middle at say 15 to 18, you want a 7-to-1 calcium-magnesium ratio. That's on your base saturation. Calcium being the flocculation agent, magnesium being the binding agent. When you get those ratios in balance, we get this nice open soil. You know, healthy soil is around 70% oxygen, and we get the right amount of magnesium to hold that soil together. Too much magnesium, we get those soils that become concrete-like when it gets dry and they crack, and when it gets wet, they get really sticky and stick to our feet, and we get platform shoes by the time we cross a paddock. Okay, so calcium-magnesium ratio, really important for the habitat. So let's assume now we've got the habitat. What's next is really important, is feeding that biology. Okay, the biology is always there. Whether it's active or not is a different story. To make it active, we've got to bring in the food source, the requirement, and the opportunity. Okay, let's start with the main food source, the start of all life, photosynthesis. For those of you that haven't, you know, really listened to what photosynthesis is, and for me at school, it was just like, I wasn't that interested. Photosynthesis is a phenomenon where the plants, the green plants on this planet, take the sunlight and carbon dioxide and form liquid carbon or carbohydrates to make the plant grow. You know, we all generally understand that. But what was missing for me was an understanding of a percentage of those sugars being produced, or that liquid carbon being produced, is actually exuded out through the roots of those plants to feed the biology, so that that biology can in return provide that plant with plant available minerals and other nutrients in the soil. You know, that to me was a real big change in my thinking. I thought plants just grew up for us to use. No, plants grow up just to increase their efficiency of their sunlight capture so that they can produce more sugars to feed the biology more. It's like a currency. The more you pay, the more services you get. So high photosynthesizing plants, really important. When plants are photosynthesizing well, you also don't get insect and fungal disease pressure. We're going to talk a bit more about how we achieve that soon. So plants, a healthy plant will take about 60% of those sugars and use it to grow upwards, and about 40% of those sugars to exude out through the roots in the form of this liquid carbon to feed the biology in return for minerals. Okay, that's the plant's payment form. Now, each plant has its own unique form of that carbohydrate or sugar. Okay, there's at least 10,000 scientifically distinguished forms of carbohydrate. Each plant has their own unique form. So if we have one or two plant species, we have one or two of these carbohydrates entering the soil, we're going to have a low diversity microbially. A bit like us as human beings, we like food, we all like different foods. You know, a KFC store is going to attract a certain community. A tofu, you know, a sushi store is going to attract a very different form of community. Okay, if we can have, it's like a mall. You've got everyone in the mall because there's lots of different food shops. Well, in the soil, we want to have lots of different plants, so we have lots of different foods entering the soil. Therefore, we have lots of microbes, all good at different things, working together, providing the nutrients and everything else that the plant needs in a whole and complete form, and a plant available form. What's really cool when we get that level of diversity, we call it quorum sensing, a level of microbial diversity that when it reaches a threshold, we get all of these outcomes that were never possible before that level of diversity was reached. It's the same in human beings. That's why we call the group quorum sensors, because once we've got all these people in a room together talking about things openly and freely and exchanging and working together, we've got these crazy cool outcomes. Okay, so more plants, more diversity of food entering the soil, more liquid carbon entering the soil, and before we move on from that subject, it's the liquid carbon pathway you want to get interested in. If you're interested in building soil, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping it into your soils, building organic matter and carbon levels in the soil is beyond decomposing biomass. Okay, we need to encourage the liquid carbon pathway, which builds soil carbon 5 times faster than decomposing biomass. Okay, really cool. So once we get that diversity of plant species into a picture, we get these crazy results that weren't predictable. You know, we get animals increasing production and performance. I've seen this time after time with no inputs. I've seen rises in soil mineral levels with no applied fertiliser, just having diverse pasture swards. And when I say diverse pastures, I want to be really careful with how we word that. You know, people use the term mixed species, and they're using 4 or 5 different species. You know, we've got to be really careful. Let's get really specific when we're talking about these things. What exactly are you growing? You know, I've got pasture swards that I've planted with having over 70 different species. It's very different to 5. The outcomes are very different. So there is no one mixed species, much like there is no one regenerative agriculture. Okay? The other cool thing is when we get this plant diversity, we get these other ecosystem services provided that we were never factoring in before. You know, pollination takes place. We get all this life coming in. We get birds coming in. Often we're scared of birds. If you drive around here in the summer at night time, you see all these green lasers flying around the sky. You think, what's going on there? Bird scarers. You know, we're too busy trying to defer and get rid of life and control the life. It's that life that is the cycle of which we're trying to build here in regenerative agriculture. You know, the self-perpetuating flywheel. Once it's up and running, it's very hard to stop. We don't need to be putting inputs in. The other cool thing is with the plant diversity, that inoculates the soil, as I said, with diverse microbial communities. Well, when an animal comes in and grazes those plants, yes, it gets all the diverse minerals, as mentioned in the presentation prior, but also it gets inoculated with diverse microbial communities, not just from the plant, but out of the soil, from within itself. Again, that opportunity and that requirement flashes on. The gut's diversified microbially. The animal becomes more resilient, literally has genes expressed that were never expressing before. Okay, our DNA or our gene expression in human beings as well is very low right now. What reflects that is diversity of food entering your system, encouraging a diversity of microbes in your gut, same as in the soil, such that we get outcomes that were never predictable for us. So you can see I'm really passionate about diversity, really passionate about biology. We create the habitat, we provide the food source, we provide the requirement and the opportunity. and we allow nature to do her thing, she can do it better than we can. And I'm telling you this from being an agronomist, from being a conventional farmer for a long, long time. The results I'm seeing out there defy our logic, and it's really cool. And I had to deal with some stuff to let go of what I thought was the truth, to discovering this stuff from a place of just wonder and awe, like wow. And what's really cool is the science is coming. Not just Sam and Gwen, there's other guys out there leading this space who are looking to, personally fund the science, and it's coming. So really exciting. Thank you.
Jono. Thank you, Jono. We're going to the panel discussion, and I try to give you a little bit of a recap of what I heard, and then I'll give the microphone to the room and the microphone for the people that are actually on Zoom as well. And remember, if you're on Zoom, the way to get the microphone is to post a Q&A question into the Q&A session and the button into your Zoom, and then Julia will actually pick up the microphone and ask the question. We started off with Sam. And Sam was very much in looking at how we can support the farming community in times of change. And he basically looked at the grassroots to drive success. And he basically discovered that there is a New Zealand grassroots that can actually drive that success. So it doesn't really matter if there are examples in other sides of the world, but we can do it here as well. Flexible system, but outcome focused. And he flagged the hard research and the field experience as sometimes being difficult to align. He also talked about improving complex systems. Then we had Emily. And Emily taught us that nutrients are interlinked. So it's the soil, it's the feed, and the animal that are all connected by these nutrients. She talked about an animal-centered system, and she actually is using regenerative agriculture in the context about health. The cool thing was when she made a conclusion and basically said, well, is regenerative agriculture for everyone? She basically said yes. Well, she actually said it can be, but I understood yes. Then we had Jono, and he moved from chemical farming to regen ag farm coach. That's a big leap, and but I think from the passion that we saw from Jono, I think he's doing well. I think he talked about diversity in soil biology, because that will actually create the resilience that we like in our New Zealand agriculture. He also said, well, listen, use tools mindfully. So he didn't say don't use tools anymore, he said use them mindfully. And if we do that, he basically told us that we can create the right habitat, and then we need to feed that habitat, and photosynthesis will play a crucial role in that. And he also told us that when people talk about mixed species, it could be from 5 to 70. And then, of course, the habitat becomes to feed. So this was a quick recap of our panelists, just to bring everything up, bring the talks back to you. May I ask the panelists to step forward and accept questions? And what we'll do is we'll start with a Zoom question first, Julia. What do you think about that?
All right. Oh, there we go. Right, we've got a question here from Sam. Like conventional agriculture, regen ag is about food production. I understand regen ag produces nutrient-dense food. Can the panel please elaborate what nutrient-dense food actually is and how it differs and is better than conventional ag?
Do you want to take that?
I'll start. Yep. So this concept of nutrient density is actually really interesting, and I think there's different parameters that you can use to identify nutrient density. When we're talking about plants, often one of those measures is sugars. Is that right? But also, in my mind, it's also about the mineral nutrition as well. So, what are the levels of these minerals and sugars in the plant? When we go on to animals by definition are nutrient dense compared to other foods. But this is something, I find really interesting, is how do we actually define a nutrient-dense animal? And for me, I suppose I apply our model that we've developed in that a nutrient-dense animal is an animal that is sufficient in the nutrients it requires.
Yeah, so my definition of nutrient density is the plant's receiving all of the macro, micro, trace, secondary metabolites that it requires in a whole and complete form, not in a man-made applied form. So when we're looking at things like Olsen P, that's already available phosphorus in your soil. It doesn't need to be biologically made available. Well, when we use biology to provide the minerals that the plant needs and the plant gets them through that network, then they're in a whole, complete form, not just on a mineral level, but a microbial level. For those of you that don't know, plants are actually quite a high percentage of microbes are within the plant. Plants actually contain and can suck up microbes from the soil. So again, making more minerals available out of the plant that often we can't even test for. So my thing is with nutrient density is that the plant gets everything it needs in a whole and complete form, and then when that animal's eaten by whoever's consuming that plant, gets all of those benefits as well.
Just in terms of like what does that mean for humans? We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, a call with a guy called Dan Kitteridge, who is a farmer and entrepreneur that founded a thing called the Bionutrient Association, I think it's called in the US. And he's developed this mass spectrometer thing, which the idea is eventually we'll have a smartphone that can scan an apple or a piece of meat or whatever, and it can tell us a nutrient profile and give us a score of some sort. And they're doing a whole lot of lab work behind the scenes to calibrate that. But basically his thing at the moment is, from a scientific perspective, we actually don't know what nutrient-dense food, like we don't have a way to kind of define and score what nutrient density looks like, and he seems like he's probably he's obviously been thinking about that for a long time, so, yeah.
Thank you so much. May I have a question in the room? Microphone is behind you.
Thank you. So I think it's really one question. I heard the word ecology mentioned quite a lot, but I'm just curious because up until this point, I still haven't heard any mention of indigenous ecology or indigenous biodiversity. Is there scope for that in this?
Yeah, sure, man. Sorry.
Oh, no, you go for it.
What's cool is the space that's here now is definitely open to that. What I'm seeing right now is like a distinction between Indigenous and what we're doing now, and that in itself can create some division. Like what I'm interested in is creating the space for us all to come together, whether it's high level or ground up, so we can understand more, what that looks like. And when we talk about diversity, well, diversity of inputs and perspective is equally as important. So I look at it like this. It's definitely. For me, myself, I've recently just learned to embrace my culture. I was the first white generation in my family. I've recently learnt a lot of my history, my Indigenous history, and it was something that I used to be embarrassed and almost ashamed about because of the environment that I grew up in, which was high country, Waitaki Valley, predominantly white farmers. And so when I started to embrace that, I started to learn a lot of cool stuff, like, for instance, how my grandmother farmed when she was a little girl up in Kaya, up the North Island. They had some knowledge. And for the first time, I was open to hearing that. Whereas before, I just thought, it's my grandmother going on again. Whereas now it's like, I can hear it, there's some validity there. Cool, let's add that to the toolkit.
I guess to me, it kind of depends on what level we're thinking about Indigenous ecology, because there's kind of if you look at a paddock and you at the moment, say a few species of grass in the soil organisms and so I'm sure there's some native. We should have Gwen here because she'd be able to answer that question. But in terms of native soil microbes, but our native pasture species aren't really suited to grazing, so they didn't involve in that context. But when you start looking at a farm scale, it's just I just come back to what are you trying to achieve? Like, what are your goals? Are your goals to restore native biodiversity in your farm system and in your catchment in your region? And if that's so, then you can weave that through. And there's some really cool ways that we can look at, this is that kind of, I know the science community is talking about mosaics of farm systems and integration and all of that. And I just think that fits beautifully with the kind of overall diversification of our farms, yeah.
Julia, do we have another Zoom question?
We'll go to the room and then we'll come back to Zoom.
Okay, another question in the room.
Morning team, Andrew Horsburgh. I've just got a quick question on the economics. Have we seen any outcomes on total dry matter produced under the mixed species versus the feed conversion ratios versus lower animal health costs? And are we going to need a premium for the produce we produce because hopefully we can get it with the market demanding this, or are we able to compete if we go down this path with the conventional outputs?
Sure. So for a start, yes, we're seeing, to answer the last question first, is yes, we can still compete without the premium. The premium's going to be pretty exciting as well. But the cool thing is the economics of it all, like the amount of money that we're spending on inputs right now is phenomenal. Like it's absurd. And when you realise that a lot of that money spent is actually what's keeping you needing to spend it. And so once you subtract some of that out, like this whole thing around this whole thing around regenerative agriculture costing more money is not the case. You've just got to look at your spending. What am I spending my money on? There's some people out there that aren't spending next to anything on fertiliser, and that's cool. But we want to make sure that the production is not production, but the profitability is right up there. On a dry matter tonnage thing, just to give you some statistics, and there's more coming. Otago University are working with a few of my clients to bring some of this information in a more black and white form, but just to give you some stats from my experiences, for instance, growing a 21 species setup crop and on the Canterbury Plains here on riverbeds on the edge of the Rangitata River. We planted 21 species in the last week of November last year, and come the last week of February, we did quadrant analysis of those 21 species. From the minute we planted, we did no fertiliser whatsoever. The tonnage come back at just under 11 tonne. By the time we went to graze that stuff, so that's 115 kilograms of dry matter per day growing with no fertiliser. When we come to graze it, the animals, it was an observation that they ate substantially less, and the milk production actually increased. And I'm talking solids as well. And just having 50% of the diet for the cows per day on this stuff, they were requiring 19 kilograms of dry matter of ryegrass and clover. What they were eating in this stuff was well below 14, and they were increasing their production. So massive yield potential. The cost of the seed mix cost $240 per hectare. To get 11 tonne out of that, that's you're barely 3 cents a kilogram established, and it increases your production. That's just a start.
Yeah. I suppose in terms of what we're hoping to do with Quorum Sense is start to try and, not just ourselves, but work with people to try and flesh out a whole lot of case studies. Obviously, if some bigger science programs get going, we'll be able to start tying that together. And we've done a little bit of an economic assessment with the pilot study that on some paired sites down in Otago. So that stuff might come out end of the year or something later. But hopefully with Quorum Sense we can start doing some detailed case studies, because it's so different for every farmer. Like some farmers are very production driven, even with a regenerative perspective, because that's what they're into. Some are very profit focused, and some are like, hey, I'm a quality of life kind of guy. This is what we're all about. I want to knock off at 3 and go and hang out with my kids, and I take it, and that's the same for every farmer. It's nothing to do with nothing different with a regen versus not ever. I think we just got to be careful, because there's been a few, some people pick up one case study and say that farmer's doing a terrible job of this, or they're not making money, that wouldn't work for me. And you're like, well, this is all about taking these ideas and adapting them to your context. And so there's tools, I think the point you made is there's tools available for everyone, I think, with this kind of ecological paradigm. So, yeah.
And you can have it all. You can have it all.
Cool. Now I know that we can have it all. The next question we've got here is an anonymous question from Zoom. If you talk about shifting the whole, how do you discuss shifting community when currently communities are primarily made up of workers who are forced to shift annually by the system, particularly in dairy?
That's a great question.
I have the least experience in dairy systems here, so I'll leave it to you guys.
You first got to assess, is that poor quality of life? Is that a problem? Moving around, I did it for 11 years. It wasn't a problem. The vibrancy and the resilience that we see in the communities is an openness and a sharing within communities, and a bringing together and moving forward together sense in the community. For for instance, seeing children taking cuttings from a diverse pasture sward to kindergarten, next minute it's a photo on the wall and the children are talking about what they're observing and learning on the farm, whereas before they weren't interested in going out on the farm. And that ripples through into, Montessori's, schools, kindergartens. It's phenomenal. And then seeing families connected with their children on farm is crazy. Working with some of my clients, we got 4 generations on the one farm, and before they couldn't agree on anything, and then now all of a sudden you create a space of openness and transparency where everyone's valid. Then these multiple generation farmers moving forward together, all embracing each other's experience and perspective, and that's the sort of resilience I see coming through in the community. And shrinking the supply chain. Recently finishing the RA20 tour that I just completed across the country. The last date of the tour was down in Invercargill, and an hour and a half was spent by people talking about how the future they see is more connected to the producer, that the town folk going straight to the farmer to buy their food and produce, and the absurdity of the current distribution model. That's the sort of thing that I see coming forth in the communities.
I'd just add to that, as someone that consults to farmers as well. Often in dairy situations, you're in a situation where you've got the contract or the share milker and you've got the owner, and there can be barriers to change there. And the share milker might be really, really into wanting to make some practical changes, to relook at their fertiliser use, but they have to convince the farm owner. And I think that's where being a coach would really help in that situation. But definitely it can be a barrier that can be overcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any questions in the room?
Thanks, Tom. Patrick Aldwell. A question about drought resistance. Is there any research going in this area in terms of RA, and is there a particular species mix that work best in increasing drought risk?
Okay, so with drought risk, I mean, the first thing is looking at, like soil carbon is very important when we're talking about, drought. Soil carbon, of course, every 1% you can hold an extra 180,000 litres of water per hectare, so it's a big deal. Firstly, water infiltration rates. Can you infiltrate water? We talk about the soil physical porosity. You've got to first address, even just 10 or 15 centimetre or millimetres of compaction on the soil surface, you've limited your gas exchange. So the start is looking at infiltration rates and holding capacity. Second thing is looking at plants' root depths, physical root depth. So ryegrass and clover with compaction, you're dealing with this much of the soil where you get a good nor'west coming through and everything's gone to seed. That's real susceptibility. What we're seeing is, and the other things that cause that are, low rates of water applied through sprinkler irrigation, preventing roots going looking for water, applying nutrients to the soil surface where the plants then don't have to go looking for the nutrients. That's a big part of the problem. So making those roots work. Thirdly is making sure those plants have a relationship with the wider mycelial network. So that mycorrhizal fungi network can extend the root mass of 90% of the plants on the planet upwards of 1,000 times the original root mass size, enabling the plant to access water reserves, nutrient reserves from the depths from wide around. And that's often severed by things like cultivation. Superphosphate use kills mycorrhizal fungi on contact. It's a really big picture thing. So getting rid of the compaction, increasing carbon levels. Just one more thing before I pass the torch is what we're seeing as far as soil organic matter increases is profound. We're talking 0.5% in 4 months I've seen just in a recent test I did in a pasture sward with 21 species.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the easier things that we can say, yes, there's definitely some real value there. And it's just, for me, just pure observation across dozens of farms and that. And something like you think about diverse pasture swards and that, one of my mentors, who's one of the earlier kind of planned grazers or whatever, taller grass grazer systems up in Hawke's Bay, Dean Martin. I decided I'd visit him every month for about 18 months to learn how his system changed over time and that. And you go to the end of winter, early spring, and this whole farm looks like ryegrass with a little bit of clover and that kind of stuff, and his covers are up. But by the time you get to November, December, it looks like cocksfoot, and by the time you get to, he gets into a dry January, February, and he's got all this paspalum, and around the paspalum everything else is growing around it, and we couldn't quite figure that out. We're assuming the paspalum's doing something to support the other plants around it, because where there's no paspalum there's nothing growing, but where there's paspalum there's other stuff growing. The point of that being he's doing all the soil, his soil health is phenomenal as well, and so he's doing all that, but he's actually leaving cover at those times. He's using cocksfoot because he wants bulk at that time of year, right, whereas he wants quality at different times for different reasons. But what that does is by having those covers, he actually catches, he's got no soil moisture whatsoever, but he's catching dew because he's got cover. And it's amazing how much grass he'll actually grow. You know, if that's an extra 1,000 kilos of growth just by catching your dews in summer and that kind of stuff, what does that do to your ability to get stock through, just having that little bit of quality? It's those small, it's kind of the detail, the nuance that makes the difference. But I'm going to be honest, it took me probably 2.5, 3 years to get my head around it. So, yeah.
Any more questions, ladies? I see a question on Zoom. Julia.
Yeah. Can you please give us some examples of the research that is coming in this space and who and what organisations are carrying it out? And that's a question from Nicole.
I kind of, about 3.5 years ago, I met Gwen Grillet from Manaki Whenua and that, so we've been bouncing ideas and put in one big proposal which wasn't successful that had a really cool drought experiment in it. And looking at that at the moment, what we found was there was a whole, in terms of like bigger science programs at least, there was this kind of discomfort in the science funding system with regenerative agriculture because of its controversy and the fact that people didn't understand what that means. And even though we tried to break it down into quite pragmatic things, as soon as anything's got a regenerative label, until about 6 months ago, it was considered too hot to touch, and now all of a sudden everyone wants to be involved in it, which is great. But what we've tried to do is be incredibly collaborative with as many people across the country as possible that are interested, sectors, scientists, different CRIs, universities, etc., and try and pull that together so we can create some kind of collaboratively produced kind of roadmap or investment map of like what are the key things that we care about, and basically offer up some opportunities for investment from a science funding perspective and some thoughts on how we'd go about that. That's what I'm particularly involved in. We've got, at different levels of research, our Quorum Sense community's got a huge amount of knowledge and enthusiasm that they'd love to partner with and do a whole lot of stuff at more of a farm scale innovation side of things, as much as being part of these bigger projects. I know, I think it's Zespri and Plant and Food are off exploring something related at the moment. Basically, it seems like most of the CRIs are starting to look to get into it. So at the moment, it's kind of nothing's really happening on the ground at the moment, but everyone's kind of starting to pitch ideas and have these discussions, and MPI is setting up advisory groups to try and help guide that. And so it's all kind of messy at the moment, to be honest. But
and I think what's cool about what you guys are doing is changing, when I say you guys, Sam and Gwen, and what we're doing with Quorum Sense is changing the way that the research is carried out. So, you know, traditionally what's happened is we look at a problem, we you know, bring it right down to basics, and we analyse, you know, these really linear functions that are taking place, and that gives us results. It gives us the data that we're also attached to, but it really leaves a big hole to be you know, filled with what else is taking place. You know, when we're dealing with ecology, it's massively complex, and the other cool thing outside of people like Sam and Gwen bringing this new holistic way of carrying out science is also seeing farmers act without the desire or attachment to the science before taking action, and using their eyes and taking on their own trial work in paddock and learning for themselves, and then sharing with their peers. You know, we don't need peer-reviewed papers to tell us what works out there, and you know, often the science only says so much. It's great to have some for a bit of comfort, but what's really exciting for me is seeing farmers act with discomfort and innovating, because science and research is not innovation. The innovation happens out there in the paddock, and that's really exciting to be part of.
Yeah. So just to caveat that, and we're kind of taking that side of the argument. The other side of the argument is, from a lot of the perspective, we've got some farmers that read peer-reviewed material on a weekly basis, and they're constantly learning from it. And there is a ton of it out there. And Murph's probably one of the guys here who's across most of it. Agroecology, microbiology, ecology. It just doesn't seem to filter its way into ag science as readily. But if you start looking a bit broader and you start looking at some of the things that science knows is happening, and you get into some of the physics stuff, and it gets quite cool, and you start to extrapolate and ask questions about what does that mean for my farming system and how can I work with that? Just because we haven't studied it in a farm systems and ag science context, we're pulling knowledge from all these different places. Agroecology is probably the closest one, and that's a various, there's tens of thousands of papers in agroecology. So I think on the one hand, we're like, we don't quite know how this is all fleshing out from a hard science perspective, and we can use our intuition and we can learn from all these other sciences, but at the same time, there's actually a heap of knowledge out there that's relevant. It's just our job to pull it together.
I just get a signal that there are 2 more questions. I have one in front of the room and I have one in the back of the room. Is that okay?
Hi guys, Richard here. Just picking up on the landscape mosaic, I guess, aspiration. What's your experience with dairy businesses that have shifted from, say, a more monoculture type system to a diversified production system? What have they adopted that's spread their risk, I guess, in their production system? And what's the process that's got them to that, mindset change?
Yep. So what I'm seeing to be really effective in the dairy farmers that I'm working with is just simply taking advantages of opportunities that present themselves without drastically and dramatically changing the whole system. So, for instance, looking at a lot of dairy farms on their platform, especially around Canterbury, like to have a summer crop of some sorts. That summer crop, you graze it once it's out of the round for a long time, and then when you graze it, it's left bare. Taking that as an opportunity to grow a diverse, what I call a setup mix, which provides that feed provision as well as it sets the soil up and gets the soil functioning such that afterwards it regrows 2 or 3 times in the following spring. You scratch into that, your perennial sward, and that's that area regrassed. So it's and with no fertiliser throughout. So that is in itself, you're spending a fraction of what you would have been spending to grow, for instance, a swede crop or a turnips and grass crop. You're growing 30 plus species, growing more tonnage, no inputs whatsoever, and it's your regrassing program, which isn't just a conventional regrassing program. By the time you come in with your perennial pasture sward, the fertility is there, it's present, the microbes are there doing the work. That's that paddock set up with no fertiliser, and to this date, I've not got one paddock that I've gone to perennial that we've had to go back and apply fert to. So it's one big change with very little risk.
I mean, the other parts of it is there's a whole bunch of Mark Anderson would be one. Go to a course like Nicole Masters' Integrity Soils course, for example. She's probably one of the best educators around that. How this whole kind of soil ecosystem function kind of things. Get your head around it and then start applying. What's in my system that's doing the bad? Some of the harm and holding us back that John was talking about. Then what are the things that I can do just in small ways? And some of that might be just more nuanced fertiliser use and shifting things here and there, shifting grazing management to a point, and then looking at opportunities for those big step changes. I think there's just dozens of different ways that kind of filters in. And again, Canterbury irrigated dairy farm is so different to a non-irrigated dairy farm down in South Otago because they've got such different challenges and systems. It's quite hard to,
One last question at the back of the room.
So today we've talked almost exclusively about pastoral scenarios where we're integrating animals, and it works really well to put 20-odd species in that sort of mixture. But when we go to more an arable situation, when we're trying to get certified seed, and usually there's a lot of herbicide and fertiliser going into those systems, and a lot of people are moving towards cover crops now. How does that scenario work where you do your cover crop and you feel good about what you've just done, then you go and put your certified seed crop in where you've got to almost decimate what's there to get certification? How's that going to work in that sort of scenario? So it's 2 steps forward, sort of 1 sideways and maybe 1 backwards. And then what do you see happening with a lot of those cover crops that are going in? Are they just getting cultivated back into the soil, or is there another purpose for them somewhere in that scenario?
Cool. Okay, so with that, probably 40% of my clientele's arable. The thing to get your head around with cover cropping is it's not the biomass that gives you the results, that's just a byproduct. it's a cool thing seeing farmers like, for instance, one of my guys never had animals on his property for 20 years. He grows a lot of certified seed in dry land mid-Canterbury. For the first time in 20 years, he's got animals in eating cover crops before termination, before planting certified cash crops. And we're being really responsible for the species that we select so that we don't interfere with our specialty seed production in a certified context. But the thing is, with cover cropping and beyond, certified seed intercropping as well, the benefits are in the soil microbially with them being stimulated and fed with the cover crop, such that it's a byproduct or a bonus if you get to graze it and return some of that, through the rumen back to the soil. And when you plant your cash crop into that, it changes the whole dialogue. Like even just the monoculture certified, for instance, grass seeds that I'm seeing coming up through terminated cover crops they're just leaping out of the ground, and we're not having to apply fertiliser at the rates we were. We're not saying from the start we're not applying any fertiliser, but it's how do I diversify my biology in the soil with the windows of opportunity available post-harvest and pre-plant. And if you're going to introduce animals to that, well, even better. You can terminate, you can, if you graze and then let it recover for a week and then hit that with a chelated glyphosate before planting your certified seed crop, well, you've already pushed the needle well beyond what you'd probably expect or what you might assume. And then intercropping beyond certified seed, well, I've got guys growing 3-4 seed crops in one paddock at one time, harvesting them together, selecting the species to suit seed dressing, and then dressing them all out separately to get clean lines at the end. My whole thing is, and there is some pushback in some industries around, for instance, cross-pollination of hybrid seed crops, which we do have to be responsible for, and there is, a bit more discussion to be had in that space. But the other thing is, my whole thing is there's some work to be done in the seed industry as well. And I'm committed to that as well. Not being so limited to. It's a bit similar to the share milker having to bring on the owner to make changes. Well, we as growers have got to demand that. Well, actually, no. We're going to need some give here. We're going to need to be able to be allowed to grow a bit more. If we're going to keep supplying these companies.
And Simon Osborne would be a good example of that. He's been working with his. The seed contractors that he's been growing for years on slowly, getting the license to take fungicides or certain amounts of fertiliser and stuff out of the system because he's giving them confidence that he can manage and grow a healthy crop without it. And so it's this ongoing thing, and he's probably helping others because he's kind of trailblazing to a point saying it can be done, therefore it's kind of opening the door for doing kind of less harm throughout that cash crop phase as well.
And also rethinking markets. Farmers creating their own markets is pretty exciting. That's going to make some people's skin crawl, but it's happening, and it's really exciting, really shrinking up that the fat in the system. When you look at what the farmers are getting, for their seed, and look at what then they're paying to get it back, sometimes you're talking 400, 500, 600%.
And I'm going to stop you there. Johnny already warned me for that this would happen. I have a feeling that we could let the panel go on for another 2-3 hours. Unfortunately, we do not have that time. I'd like to thank the panel tremendously for being here and inspiring us for what seems to be something that everybody can do. John, Sam, Emily, thank you so much. Thank you also very much for feeling yourself extremely welcome here at Blink. And if you are in the neighborhood or if you want to connect with us even further, we have 2 VIBE events lined up. On the 2nd of September, we have the Rural Leaders. And on the 13th of October, we are looking at water. Then, if you really have a feeling that this is a really cool place to be, you can actually come and share a day with us. And we also have hot desking and space available here for you to use. And if you do decide to do that, the first day will be on Julia, Katie. I think it will be on Carolyn, your first day. So that is free of charge. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for connecting to each other. Please do so. And if you haven't introduced yourself, taking social distancing in consideration to your neighbor, please do so, because wonderful things will happen. Thank you so much.